Imagine a war so short, you could start watching this video, make yourself a cup of tea, and by the time you returned, the war would already be over. Not weeks, not days, not even hours, just 38 minutes. Yes, 38 minutes was all it took for a palace to burn, for hundreds of lives to be lost, and for the fate of a nation to be sealed forever. It sounds impossible, like a legend whispered through time, but it is real, it is recorded, and it is known as the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in human history. But history, as always, is never so simple. Behind this half-hour war lies a story filled with betrayal, ambition, and the merciless weight of empire. So, if history's untold stories intrigue you, if you want to walk through the shadows of the past and uncover the moments that shaped our world, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the past is not dead. It whispers still, and together we will listen to understand how the guns thundered that morning in 1896. We must peel back the layers of Zanzibar itself, an island wrapped in beauty, blood, and secrets. On the map, Zanzibar is just a speck, a jewel floating in the Indian Ocean just off the coast of East Africa. To travelers, it was paradise, a land of white sands, swaying palms, and air so thick with the scent of cloves that sailors claimed they could smell the island miles before their ships reached it. But beneath this beauty lurked a shadow. Zanzibar was not only the spice island, it was also the beating heart of the slave trade. For centuries, countless men, women, and children from mainland Africa were captured, chained, and brought to Zanzibar. There, they were sold in crowded markets, their fates sealed by the strike of a trader's hand. The island was a paradox, wealth built on misery, paradise built on chains. And because of this wealth, Zanzibar attracted the eyes of empires. By the 19th century, the British Empire ruled the seas. Its navy stretched from Europe to Asia. Its colonies spanned across continents. But the empire always wanted more, and control of trade in East Africa was vital. Zanzibar was the key. Whoever held it could dominate the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. And so, Britain, like a shadow over the horizon, tightened its grip on the island. By 1890, Zanzibar was declared a British protectorate. On paper, it still had its own sultan. In reality, the sultan was little more than a figurehead, his crown heavy but powerless, while the true strings were pulled by the British consulate. And yet, despite their dominance, Britain faced a challenge, one that would explode with cannon fire in 1896. The spark came on August 25, 1896. The reigning Sultan, Hamad bin Thuwaini, suddenly died inside his palace. Officially, his death was natural, but whispers swirled through the narrow streets of Zanzibar city. Poison. Who would benefit from the Sultan's death? Who stood ready to seize the throne? Within hours, his cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, marched into the palace with armed guards. He declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar. He did not wait for permission, nor seek Britain's approval. He simply seized the throne, bold, defiant, unstoppable. But there was one problem. Britain already had its own candidate in mind. Hamad bin Mohammed, a man loyal, obedient, and, above all, controllable. For Britain, Khalid's sudden claim to power was unacceptable. This was not just about a throne, this was about control. And in the age of empire, defiance came at a deadly price. Khalid knew what was coming. He had watched the British long enough to understand their hunger for control. But he was no puppet. He dreamed of independence, of a Zanzibar free from foreign masters, and he would fight for it. By the evening of August 26th, the palace had become a fortress. Over 2,800 men, soldiers, palace guards, and loyal supporters were gathered inside. Cannons were dragged to the gates, rifles stacked in armories, and the royal yacht, the Glasgow, was armed and anchored in the harbor. Khalid's message was clear: I will not bow. But across the harbor, the sea bristled with power. 5 British warships loomed like steel beasts, their cannons aimed directly at the palace walls. And on land, British Marines waited for orders, rifles gleaming in the tropical sun. The island of Zanzibar trembled under the weight of silence. Everyone knew the countdown had begun. At the British consulate, Basil Cave, the consul drafted a message. His words were simple, cold, and final. Leave the palace by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or we will open fire. The message was delivered. The deadline set. The world's most powerful empire had issued its ultimatum. That night, Zanzibar held its breath. Families huddled in their homes. Traders abandoned the markets. From rooftops, eyes fixed on the harbor, where the warships waited like predators circling their prey. Inside the palace, Khalid refused to flinch. His advisors urged caution. Some even begged him to yield. But Khalid stood firm. Let them come. Zanzibar will not kneel. The decision was made. There would be no surrender. The clock ticks toward war. And so, as dawn crept over the island on August 27, 1896, the stage was set. The palace bristling with defenders. The harbor lined with British warships. The city caught in the shadow of fear. The deadline was minutes away. The cannons were loaded. The soldiers stood ready. The people prayed. And as the clock struck 9, history prepared to witness a war unlike any other. The morning of August 27, 1896, was not like any other morning in Zanzibar. The sun rose quietly, painting the horizon in gold. The waters of the Indian Ocean shimmered like glass. But beneath that calm beauty, the island was a volcano ready to erupt. At the British consulate, the clock ticked louder with each passing minute. 9 a.m., the deadline. Basil Cave had given Sultan Khalid to surrender the palace and abandon his throne. If he did not, the British warships waiting in the harbor had orders to unleash their fury. Across town, in the grand palace of stone and coral, Khalid stood firm, defiant. He had heard the ultimatum. He had weighed his options, but surrender was not one of them. Instead, he ordered his men to bar the palace gates, to man the cannons, and to ready their rifles. Drums echoed in the courtyards. Soldiers stood at their posts, faces tense, hearts pounding. For them, this was no longer just about a sultan. This was about honor, about resisting the empire that had humiliated their land. And yet, even in that moment, many must have wondered, can we really stand against Britain? On one side, Khalid had nearly 2,800 men inside the palace grounds. Some were palace guards, others ordinary citizens who had answered his call. They had rifles, swords, and a few artillery pieces positioned at the gates. And in the harbor, his royal yacht, the Glasgow, was armed and ready, its flag of defiance fluttering in the morning breeze. But on the other side loomed the might of empire. The British had 5 warships, each bristling with cannons, capable of leveling the palace walls in minutes. On shore, nearly 150 sailors and marines stood ready with Gatling guns. the terrifying rapid-fire weapons that could cut through ranks of men like a farmer's scythe through grass. The imbalance was staggering. Khalid's men were brave, but bravery alone cannot stand against industrial firepower. Still, he believed the British might hesitate. Perhaps the world's most powerful empire would not dare unleash destruction in broad daylight, in front of the world, on a small island. But Khalid underestimated something: Britain's pride. Inside the consulate, Basil Cave's hands were steady as he checked his watch. Only minutes remained. He looked toward the harbor, where Admiral Harry Rawson stood aboard the flagship St. George. Rawson was not a man of hesitation. His cannons were loaded, his ships aligned. He waited only for the clock to strike. In the palace, whispers spread like fire. Advisors urged Khalid once more to reconsider. The British were not bluffing, they said. Their warships could reduce the palace to rubble in minutes. But Khalid's answer was simple, unyielding. Zanzibar will not kneel. If I am Sultan, I will remain Sultan. If I fall, I will fall as Sultan. And so the stage was set. The streets were empty now. Civilians had fled, doors barred, markets abandoned. From rooftops and alleyways, a few daring eyes watched the harbor, where silence reigned. Then the bells tolled. The clock struck 9 a.m. The deadline was over. The ultimatum had expired, and the shortest war in history was about to begin. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the order was given. A thunderclap tore across the harbor. The first British shell screamed through the air and slammed into the palace, exploding in fire and smoke. The ground shook. Windows shattered. The roar of cannons echoed through the city. Khalid's men answered back, their cannons thundering from the palace gates, their rifles cracking toward the ships. The royal yacht Glasgow opened fire, its guns flashing defiantly. But their resistance was like sparks against a storm. The British warships responded with relentless fury. Shell after shell pounded the palace walls. Within minutes, towers collapsed, the roof caved in, and flames spread across the grand halls where sultans had once ruled in splendor. The Glasgow was struck, its hull torn open, water rushing in. The proud royal yacht began to sink, its flag still fluttering, even as the sea swallowed it whole. On land, Gatling guns rattled like a drum of death, mowing down defenders who tried to hold the gates. The palace courtyard became a battlefield of smoke, fire, and falling stone. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Soldiers scrambled to return fire. Servants fled, screaming through corridors of flame. The wounded cried out as rubble fell around them. And yet, even in the inferno, Khalid remained defiant. He refused to step into the open, refused to surrender. He believed the palace could hold, but the truth was clear. No fortress of stone could withstand the guns of empire. By 9:20 a.m., less than 20 minutes after the first shot, the palace was a ruin. Entire sections had collapsed. The once beautiful structure was now a smoking carcass, its walls scorched black, its courtyards littered with the fallen. Still, the British guns did not stop. The bombardment continued, tearing apart what little remained, ensuring no symbol of defiance could survive. By 9:38 a.m., only 38 minutes after the first shot, the guns finally fell silent. The war, if it could even be called that, was over. Nearly 500 defenders lay dead or wounded. The palace was destroyed. The yachts sunk. The Sultan's army shattered. And Khalid himself vanished into the smoke. The shortest war in human history had ended. but its consequences had only just begun. When the thunder of cannon fire finally faded, silence returned to Zanzibar. But it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of ruin. The palace, once the proud seat of the Sultan, was now nothing more than a shattered skeleton. Its grand coral walls lying in heaps, its chambers engulfed in smoke. The harbor, moments before alive with gunfire, was littered with debris. The royal yacht Glasgow was gone, sunk beneath the waves. Pieces of timber and twisted metal bobbed on the water's surface, along with the bodies of sailors who had gone down with the ship. The smell of burning wood and gunpowder hung heavy in the air, and across the city, people emerged cautiously from their homes, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. It had begun and ended so quickly that many could hardly believe it. 38 minutes. That was all it had taken for an empire to crush a throne. But what of Sultan Khalid? When the bombardment began, he had taken shelter in the palace's harem section, the thickest walled part of the structure. As shell after shell smashed into the palace, he remained there, surrounded by a few loyal guards, determined to hold out. But by the time the clock neared 9:30, it was clear that all was lost. The palace was collapsed. His men were dying in droves. Staying meant certain death. And so, in the chaos and smoke, Khalid fled. With a handful of loyal followers, he slipped through a back gate, leaving behind his ruined palace and fallen soldiers. He did not leave as a sultan. He left as a fugitive. The streets of Zanzibar were crawling with British patrols, but Khalid knew where to go. Just a few hundred yards away lay the German consulate. Germany, a rival of Britain in East Africa, had a small presence on the island, and Khalid, desperate and defeated, dashed into their compound, seeking asylum. The British demanded his surrender. They wanted him in chains, paraded as a lesson to any who dared defy their rule. But the Germans refused. They would not hand him over. And so Khalid, protected by international law and German pride, slipped from Britain's grasp. For the British, the matter was settled. Khalid might have escaped, but his reign was over. A new sultan, Hamud bin Mohammed, was swiftly installed, the very man the British had chosen from the start. Hamud was everything Britain wanted: loyal, obedient, and willing to follow orders. Under his rule, Zanzibar became little more than a puppet state, its strings pulled firmly from London. Khalid remained in the German consulate for days, guarded by German Marines. The British blockaded the compound, determined not to let him flee. But the Germans, unwilling to yield, hatched a daring plan. One night, under the cover of darkness, Khalid was smuggled out, hidden aboard a small boat. He was carried past the British blockade and ferried to a German warship anchored offshore. From there, he was transported to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania. He had escaped the island, but he had lost everything. His throne, his power, his kingdom. He would live out the rest of his life in exile, a sultan without a sultanate. The numbers tell their own story. In those brief 38 minutes, nearly 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded. Most were palace guards and civilians caught in the crossfire. By contrast, Britain suffered only one injured sailor. It was not a war. It was a slaughter. The ruins of the palace stood as a grim reminder of Britain's message: defy us, and this is your fate. And the people of Zanzibar understood. Any illusions of independence, any dreams of defiance, were silenced that day beneath the thunder of British guns. As the fires smoldered, Zanzibar city reeled in shock. Families searched for loved ones among the ruins. Survivors wandered the streets in a daze, their homes destroyed, their lives shattered. The slave markets, already dwindling under British pressure, came to a complete halt. Soldiers patrolled the streets, enforcing order, ensuring no spark of rebellion could rise again. To the outside world, it was just a footnote, a strange curiosity, the shortest war in history. Newspapers in London printed it almost with amusement, as though it were nothing more than an oddity. But to the people of Zanzibar, it was not short. It was devastating. 38 minutes had changed their world forever. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was more than just a brief skirmish. It was a symbol of the times. It showed, in the most brutal way, the imbalance between Europe's industrial empires and the smaller nations they dominated. A palace of stone could not stand against steel warships. Muskets could not match machine guns. A proud sultan could not resist the will of an empire. And it marked the final turning point for Zanzibar. From that day on, the island was not its own. Its sultan was chosen by foreigners, its policies dictated by foreign powers. Its independence was gone, erased in less than an hour. Years later, Khalid would attempt to return to politics in German East Africa, but he was no longer the Sultan of Zanzibar. He was a shadow of the man who had once defied the British Empire. In 1916, during World War I, the British finally captured him after taking control of German East Africa. He was exiled once again, this time to Seychelles, and later to Mombasa in Kenya, where he lived quietly until his death in 1927. A life that began in power ended in exile. A man who once ruled an island died far from home. The Anglo-Zanzibar War remains unique in history, not because of the scale of its destruction, but because of its brevity. 38 minutes. That is all it took for the might of empire to erase a throne, to bend a nation to its will. For Britain, it was a demonstration of power. For Zanzibar, it was a tragedy. For the world, it was a lesson. In the age of empire, resistance could be brave, but it could also be hopeless. This was the story of the shortest war in history, a war that proves time does not measure importance, only impact. If you were gripped by this journey, if you want to walk through the shadows of the past and uncover the moments that shaped our world, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the past is not dead. It whispers still, and together we will listen.